A crisis group has been set up and daily talks are going on as investigations continue over a hack on major law firm HWL Ebsworth. The law firm has contracts across 40 government departments, including Defence and Foreign Affairs. Russia's cyber criminals claim to have published troves of sensitive data. Where are we up to with this and how bad is it?
Any hack of government-related or private sector servers that deal with government work is bad. And, excuse me, this is looking particularly bad in terms of, the amount of material. It's 4 terabytes, which doesn't sound like much, but it's an awful lot of documents, that the government, that the Russians would have access to. And then they can go through those documents and exploit that information to our disadvantage. So I think that the government is now taking appropriate steps to try and identify the nature of the hack, the potential magnitude of the damage, and try to take measures to prevent exploitation of that material.
Is the media likely able to find out what this material was and just how much of a security risk it is in the future?
It's unlikely that the media will be given a detailed briefing on exactly what was taken. But I think that the government would be wise to sort of take measures in the future to ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen again. You may recall some years back, the Chinese government hacked into the Australian Parliament system. And so there's been a series of these hacker attacks on Australian government interests over the last few years by the Chinese and the Russians. And so we do need to start taking more assertive measures to be more proactive to prevent these sorts of attacks in the future. And it's not just for government. I think private sector also has to take this seriously. Ebsworth obviously is a law firm. So therefore, I think this is a lesson for us is that anyone is a target by the Chinese and the Russians if they don't take appropriate protective measures.
Belarus has been taking delivery of Russian tactical nuclear weapons, the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russia has deployed nukes outside of the country. What is Putin's game plan here?
Well, it's hard to know. I think it really does come down to rattling nuclear sabres to try and intimidate NATO and the EU into backing down its support for Ukraine at a critical point when Ukraine is undertaking counteroffensive operations. Those counteroffensive operations are not going to be swift. They're going to be prolonged. They're going to be challenging for the Ukrainians. They're going to take losses, as we've already seen. And so the Russians are going to try and use nuclear threats, implicit and explicit, to try and intimidate the West into backing off from supporting Ukraine. And if the West were to blink, then that could turn the tide in favour of the Russians. So what we have to do is make sure we don't blink. We have to maintain our support for the Ukrainians. Those nuclear weapons, I think, are clearly a threat to NATO. In a real crisis, in a really dangerous situation, would Putin try to use them? Potentially. And so therefore, in addition to supporting Ukraine, what we also have to do is strengthen our deterrence message to Moscow to basically make it clear that any use of nuclear weapons would lead to a devastating response on the part of NATO.
And just finally, there's been a rare display of weakness by Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's raised concerns about the inadequacy of Russia's military hardware. What do you think this admission means for the Russian president?
Well, look, I think that this is an indication that Putin is very much thinking in terms of the long-term game here. He's thinking in terms of how to stretch this out in Ukraine to the point whereby Western support does fade away. So we have, as I said, we have to make sure that doesn't happen. But he's also addressing some of the concerns about how to sustain this conflict into the long term. He doesn't want a short war, he wants a long war. And so therefore he's basically identifying areas where clearly the Russians do have a lot of weaknesses, and they have so many more weaknesses than just those areas you're talking about. But he's identifying those areas that need to be addressed quickly in order to ensure that Russia can drag this out to the point whereby, as Putin is hoping, the West does lose support for Ukraine, and then Russia can have a chance of winning. We have to prevent that from happening at all costs.
Good to get your thoughts as always. Malcolm, thanks for joining us on the program. Malcolm Davis there.
Thank you.